There are places in the world where silence does not bring peace. A cemetery is supposed to be quiet, a resting ground where the living can step carefully among stone markers and feel a sense of solemn closure. Yet there are cemeteries where silence does not mean rest. Instead, it feels heavy, watchful, as if the earth itself is waiting for something to stir. Those who have walked through these places at night speak of footsteps that do not belong to them, of shadows that lean too close, of whispers that do not fade with the wind. Cemeteries are filled with names that no one speaks anymore. Marble and granite slabs tilt at odd angles, some half consumed by moss, others cracked and leaning into the soil. Behind every stone is a life that once carried weight, breath, and voice. Yet in time, those names vanish from memory. The graves remain, but the people are gone. It is in that forgotten space between the living and the erased that something unsettles. It is where fear takes shape. Imagine the moment when you step inside such a place. The air is colder than the streets outside, even though the night is the same. Trees stretch over the graves, their branches twisted like veins, filtering the moonlight into fractured patterns on the ground. The stones glow pale and uneven under the sky, but between them the shadows grow thick. You hear leaves shifting. You hear gravel crunch softly beneath weight that is not your own. Those who told their stories of this cemetery were not seeking attention. They were shaken. Their voices cracked when they explained what they had seen or heard. They spoke of a figure that wandered the graves, always at night, always in silence. No one could describe the face because no one ever saw one. Some said the figure stood too long at a single headstone. Others swore it moved soundlessly across the rows, never breaking stride, even as the living froze and stared. It is easy to dismiss such accounts as imagination. People walk into a cemetery at night and their senses betray them. The human mind fills silence with noise, fills darkness with figures. But the troubling thing about this cemetery is that the stories are the same. They repeat across decades. They come from children, from grieving widows, from guards whose job was to keep vandals out. Their accounts are almost identical. Footsteps behind them, the presence of someone too close, the weight of eyes that were not there. One of the earliest accounts spoke of a woman who came to lay flowers on her husband's grave. She had visited in the day before, but the arrangement she placed was gone. Not broken, not scattered, gone as if lifted clean from the soil. She returned at dusk, and as the light failed, she saw a shape kneeling where the flowers had been. She thought at first it was another mourner, until the figure rose and turned slightly, revealing nothing but a hollow outline. She ran, leaving the flowers clutched in her hands, and she did not return at night again. Children once dared each other to walk through the cemetery after dark. They never stayed long. One group described being followed by a tall figure that seemed to drift behind them. When they reached the gates, it stopped. They said it remained at the edge, motionless, until the last of them stepped outside. When they glanced back, there was nothing to see. But in the following weeks, each of those children claimed to hear footsteps behind them on empty roads. The most unsettling detail is not that people saw something, but that the place itself seemed to resist forgetting. Stones moved. Flowers vanished. Names carved into rock that should have endured centuries wore away in unnatural patterns, leaving unreadable gaps. No one maintained the ground, but certain graves appeared disturbed, soil unsettled even when no burials had taken place. By the mid-century, whispers circulated that the cemetery was more than a resting place. Locals avoided it at night. Some said they felt the pull of the dead, a pressure in the chest, a slowing of breath as though something underground wanted recognition. Others believed it was not the dead at all, but something born from grief itself, a form that walked because sorrow refused to fade. When people pass a cemetery in daylight, they rarely stop. They glance at the stones and keep moving, but here, even in the brightness of morning, there is unease. Birds grow quiet. The wind seems to still. Visitors leave quickly, unwilling to linger too long between the rows. There is no peace here. The land holds its silence like a secret it will never release. So the stories continue. They move through generations, always the same rhythm, footsteps, shadows, presence. No one captures evidence, no one finds the source, and yet everyone who enters comes away changed. It leaves a question that lingers more heavily than any explanation. What refuses to stay buried when the world has already forgotten their names? The cemetery stands on the edge of a town that rarely appears on maps. Its streets are quiet, its buildings worn with age, its people accustomed to keeping their voices low when night falls. Generations have lived here without seeking much beyond survival. Yet nearly every family has a story tied to the cemetery. They inherit it not through books or records, but in the form of whispered warnings at dinner tables, or hushed conversations exchanged when someone asks why the gates are always locked before dusk. The burial ground was established long before the town had paved streets. At first it served the poor, those who could not afford ornate tombs or gilded memorials. Wooden crosses once stood in place of stone, markers that eventually rotted away, leaving only bare earth above forgotten names. Later, when war reached the outskirts of the town, soldiers who fell in battle were brought here. Their graves formed a row along the northern wall, marked by stones so worn that the inscriptions blur into nothing. Families would walk through the rows with trembling hands, brushing moss from surfaces in hopes of reading even a fragment of a name. Few ever succeeded. With time, entire families were laid to rest in this soil. Some headstones stand grouped together, tilted at matching angles as though the earth itself could not bear their weight. In other corners, single graves rest alone, their stones chipped and faded, belonging to people no one in the town remembers. These solitary markers seem to attract the most unease. Even in daylight, visitors tend to pass them quickly, as though some instinct whispers that those who lie beneath were not granted peace. Locals recall that the cemetery was once tended by a man who lived in a shack near the gates. He worked silently, trimming weeds, straightening fallen stones, carrying water for fresh flowers. He grew old among the graves until one day he vanished. His shack remained, the tools left leaning against the walls, a coat hanging by the door. Some say he left without explanation, while others insist that his disappearance was not his choice. After he was gone, no one took his place. The grounds grew wild. Ivy crawled over stones, soil shifted, trees stretched wide and heavy as if to claim the dead for themselves. It is said that the cemetery has moods. On some days, the air feels still and heavy, pressing down on visitors until they rush to leave. On other days, the wind slips through the trees and carries with it the faintest sounds. The shuffle of steps, the murmur of voices, the echo of something untraceable. Those who hear it struggle to describe it afterward. Some say it resembles prayers spoken in a language they do not know. Others say it sounds like weeping. The town's church stands less than a mile away, yet even the priests have confessed unease. Old records mention that burial rites were sometimes cut short, as if the ground itself resisted acceptance. The soil was difficult to dig, harder than elsewhere, as though it had been turned too many times before. Graves collapsed before coffins could be lowered. Families took this as an omen, whispering among themselves that the earth did not want to be disturbed. There are stories passed down of funerals interrupted by sudden weather. Rain clouds would gather without warning, lightning striking so close to the gates that mourners fled. On other occasions, fog rolled in and blanketed the cemetery, covering the mourners until they could no longer see each other, each one standing alone among the stones. By the time the fog lifted, the service would end in silence, people leaving without exchanging a word. Generations who grew up here learned early to avoid the cemetery at night. Parents warned their children with simple rules: never cross the gates after sunset, never linger too long by the older graves, and never, under any circumstance, respond if they heard their names spoken within those walls. The warnings were spoken calmly, without explanation, but the weight behind them was clear. They were not suggestions. They were survival. Despite this, there were always those who disobeyed. Teenagers dared each other to climb the walls, convinced the warnings were nothing more than stories designed to scare them. Some returned pale and trembling, unwilling to describe what they saw. Others swore they heard voices calling from beneath the soil, muffled but unmistakable. A few left town shortly after their visit, claiming they could no longer sleep without waking to the sound of footsteps circling their homes. Even those who never entered the cemetery felt its reach. People living in houses nearby spoke of lights flickering at night, shadows stretching unnaturally across their walls, dogs barking endlessly at the direction of the graves. Some families moved away entirely, unwilling to endure the slow creep of fear that settled over their homes. The properties were sold cheaply, left to strangers who often left within a year. The cemetery's reputation did not come from ghost stories told by children. It came from the steady weight of shared experience. The guards who were hired to patrol the grounds left quickly, unable to tolerate the quiet that seemed to press against them. The church no longer held vigils on All Souls' Day within those walls. Families buried their dead elsewhere if they could afford it. Those who could not had no choice but to place their loved ones in the soil and hope that nothing followed them home. The town learned to live with it. They stopped asking questions, They stopped seeking explanations. Yet even in silence, the cemetery remained a presence. It stood at the edge of the town like a wound that never healed, reminding every passerby that the past is never fully buried. And in that silence, in that forgotten ground where names are erased and stones crumble, there lingers a question heavier than any sermon or prayer. What does the earth hold on to when the living try to let go? The mystery of the cemetery did not arrive all at once. It unfolded gradually, like a shadow stretching across generations. Small details passed from one account to the next until the pattern became impossible to ignore. It began with unease, with people walking the paths and swearing they felt a presence behind them. It deepened when the same people returned home and found they could not sleep, the sound of footsteps echoing in their minds long after leaving the grounds. The earliest reports spoke of ordinary visits that shifted suddenly into something abnormal. A grieving widow described kneeling at her husband's grave when the air grew still and heavy. She looked up and saw a figure standing several stones away, tall and rigid, its head turned toward her. At first she thought it was another mourner, but the figure did not move, did not speak, and when she blinked it seemed closer. She dropped the flowers in her hands and left without daring to look back. Days later she returned in daylight, only to find the flowers she had dropped were missing, as though the earth had swallowed them whole. From then on, the stories began to repeat. Groups of young men who snuck inside after curfew told of hearing footsteps on the gravel behind them. They whispered that no matter how quickly they walked, the sound followed an exact rhythm, stopping only when they reached the gate. Children dared each other to call out into the dark, but none were foolish enough to wait for an answer. Still, some claimed they heard their names whispered in a voice too faint to recognize. The cemetery began to leave signs of disturbance. Flowers placed neatly on graves vanished overnight. Sometimes they were found scattered far from where they had been set. Sometimes they were never found at all. Candles burned low until only melted wax remained, even when mourners swore they had not been lit. Stones shifted slightly from one visit to the next, angles changing in ways no storm or passing animal could explain. One night a caretaker locked the gates and circled the grounds to ensure no one lingered. As he passed a cluster of older graves, he heard what he swore was a shuffle of soil. He turned quickly and saw a mound near one of the markers, as if freshly disturbed. Yet no burial had taken place there in decades. He fled before finishing his patrol, keys clutched so tightly in his hand that the metal cut into his palm. He never returned to the job. By the mid-century, the events grew harder to ignore. Families who buried their loved ones there began to notice strange things soon after. One family claimed that every time they visited their father's grave, the soil appeared uneven, as though something pressed upward from below. Another spoke of hearing the faint hum of a voice when standing by their mother's stone, too low to understand but impossible to dismiss. Patterns emerged. The stories were not isolated. They spanned years, told by different people, all describing the same impressions: the weight of eyes unseen, the echo of footsteps where no one walked, the constant sense that someone moved just outside the edges of vision. One of the most chilling accounts came from a group of children who cut across the cemetery on their way home. They noticed a tall figure walking parallel to them through the rows of stones. It never turned its head, never quickened its pace, yet remained beside them no matter how fast they ran. When they reached the gate, the figure stopped. They turned once, breathless, to see it standing among the graves, unmoving. Then it was gone. In the weeks that followed, each child claimed to hear footsteps outside their bedroom windows at night. Some spoke of the way the cemetery seemed to rearrange itself. Headstones leaned where they had not leaned before. Paths narrowed, choked by roots that seemed to grow overnight. Names on stones faded in irregular ways, letters dissolving into nothing while others remained sharp. Visitors said it felt as though the land itself shifted when no one was watching. No explanation ever satisfied the witnesses. Trespassers could not account for the flowers that vanished. Weather could not account for stones that moved. Imagination could not explain why strangers told nearly identical stories decades apart. It was not the kind of mystery solved with evidence. It was a collection of experiences overlapping, building into a weight that the town could not ignore. Even those who did not believe found themselves uneasy when they passed the gates. The atmosphere pressed against them, colder than the air outside, carrying a silence that did not belong. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of anticipation, as though something beneath the soil was listening. The mystery was no longer in whether something walked there. It was in why. Why did footsteps follow the living so faithfully? Why did shadows linger by the graves when no bodies stood there? Why did objects vanish as if claimed by hands unseen? And perhaps most troubling, why did the same stories repeat themselves year after year, generation after generation, as though the cemetery were determined never to let its legend fade? The cemetery did not explain itself. It simply endured. People entered, they experienced, they left shaken, and the stories multiplied. What began as quiet unease became a tapestry of fear woven through time, until the town carried it like an inheritance. And so the question deepened, growing sharper with every passing decade. If the dead are meant to rest, then why does this place insist on moving among the living? The mystery of the cemetery has never relied on stories alone. Over the years, fragments of evidence have surfaced, small, incomplete pieces that refuse to fit into any simple explanation. They do not solve the puzzle, but instead make it sharper, heavier, harder to look away from. If the stories could be dismissed as superstition, the evidence lingers like ash, impossible to sweep away. Local authorities kept records of disturbances in the cemetery. Reports of trespassers filled the files, though each time the description of the intruder shifted. Sometimes it was a tall man in dark clothing, sometimes a figure hunched and shrouded. Guards chased them, but no chase ended in capture. Footsteps led into rows of stones and simply stopped. Flashlights swept across soil and grass, revealing nothing. Officers returned to their stations with empty hands, their voices uneasy when pressed to explain. The reports grew repetitive. Suspect entered the grounds, suspect vanished without trace. More disturbing were the objects found scattered across the graves. Melted candle wax pressed into the soil, though no one admitted to lighting candles. Symbols carved into tree bark, some resembling crude crosses, others twisted in unfamiliar shapes. On one occasion, a series of small bones was discovered arranged in a circle near the northern wall, as though carefully placed by deliberate hands. Investigators suggested vandals, yet no group ever came forward, no individual was caught, and the symbols never repeated in a way that could be traced to a person or movement. They appeared, disturbed the ground, and then faded, leaving only whispers in their wake. The families of the dead left testimony as well, though theirs carried more pain than detail. A woman described laying flowers on her son's grave, only to find the petals shriveled within hours, blackened as though burned, though no flame had touched them. Another spoke of arriving in daylight to find a faint impression on the soil near her father's stone, an imprint resembling a knee pressed hard into the ground, though no visitor had been there since the burial. Caretakers, priests and guards all carried their own accounts. One priest confessed privately that he had heard voices while delivering last rites at the cemetery. He claimed the words overlapped his own prayers, too faint to understand but strong enough to break his concentration. He stumbled through the ceremony, his voice trembling, and when he finished, he fled. He never officiated a burial there again. The record of his confession survives in church notes, hidden in margins where he tried to explain it away as stress. Yet the handwriting shakes and the words are uneven, as though his hand refused to steady. Psychologists who studied the accounts pointed to grief as the cause. They said the mind, under the weight of loss, creates images and sounds that are not there. Hallucinations are not uncommon in mourning, they insisted. Yet when pressed about the overlapping stories, the psychologist faltered. How could strangers, separated by years and circumstance, describe the same figure, the same footsteps, the same silence that pressed too close? The explanation thinned quickly, leaving more unease than comfort. Some locals attempted to gather proof themselves. They carried cameras, recorders, flashlights into the cemetery after dark. Most returned with nothing but static and shadows, yet a handful swore otherwise. One photograph showed a row of graves, but between two stones a pale shape blurred into the air, too tall to be light and too thin to be human. Another recording captured what sounded like breathing, steady and slow, though the person holding the device was alone. These pieces never reached beyond the town. They passed hand to hand, fading with time until only the stories remained. Theories grew around these fragments. Some believed the disturbances were the result of rituals, remnants of an older practice tied to the land long before the cemetery was founded. Others said the ground itself had absorbed too much grief, too much sorrow pressed into the soil until it took shape. The land was not haunted, they argued. It was alive, fed by the constant weight of mourning. Still, the fragments of evidence leave more contradictions than answers. Candle wax suggests visitors, but why appear only on certain graves? Symbols carved into wood suggest ritual, but why scatter them irregularly across decades? Bones arranged in circles suggest intent, but why never repeat in the same place? Each clue raises a question that collapses into silence, leaving only fear. And then there is the matter of the footsteps. Too many have heard them. Guards, children, priests, families, they all speak of the same rhythm. Heavy enough to press gravel, soft enough to vanish at will. No recording has captured them. No photograph shows their source. Yet the witnesses are consistent, each describing the same pattern. Steps behind, pause when they stop, silence when they turn. Always close enough to feel, never close enough to see. It is this consistency that unsettles the most. Evidence can be explained away. Bones could be placed by animals, wax by vandals, symbols by pranksters. But footsteps shared across decades, carried by voices that never met. What can explain that? The cemetery refuses to give an answer. It offers fragments scattered like broken glass, each reflecting something different, none showing the whole. Families continue to bury their dead elsewhere if they can. Those who cannot place their loved ones in that soil and leave quickly, unwilling to linger, unwilling to risk hearing steps where no one walks. And still, each generation inherits the weight of the same puzzle. Evidence collected, testimonies gathered, explanations offered, all vanish into the silence of the cemetery. Only the fear remains, because in the end what haunts most is not what is seen but what is nearly proven. Not the shadows themselves, but the fragments that suggest the shadows are real. Not the footsteps, but the silence that swallows them when you turn. Fear does not always strike in sudden bursts. Sometimes it seeps slowly into lives, steady as a drip of water, until it changes the way people live and think. The cemetery's greatest wound on the town was not the footsteps, not the shifting stones, not even the stories whispered across decades. Its true mark was the way it unsettled hearts and minds, eroding the fragile sense of peace that people sought in death. For families, grief was already unbearable. The cemetery was meant to provide closure, a place where they could speak softly to the ground and leave tokens of remembrance. Instead, it twisted that act into something heavy and uncertain. A mother standing by her child's grave did not feel comfort. She felt watched. She left flowers but doubted they would remain by morning. She prayed, but her words seemed to fall into silence that listened too closely. She returned home not with relief but with suspicion, as though something had followed her back. Children in the town grew up with this atmosphere woven into their earliest memories. They learned quickly that the cemetery was not like others. Some would not walk past its gates even in daylight, crossing the road to avoid the sight of the stones. Others dared each other to peer through the rusting iron bars at night, but the laughter always broke quickly, replaced by a hush when the air grew still. Many carried that unease into adulthood. Even long after leaving the town, they spoke of the way shadows lingered at the edges of their dreams, the way they sometimes woke with the sensation of footsteps pacing outside their doors. Guards hired to watch the grounds endured their own deterioration. At first, they dismissed the stories as tricks of the mind. They carried flashlights, walked their routes, told themselves the silence was nothing unusual. But hours passed differently inside those walls. Time felt stretched, elongated by every crack of a branch, every sweep of wind. The footsteps came eventually. Each guard heard them, and each swore the sound pressed closer the longer they stayed. One man returned home after a shift and could not sleep, convinced he heard the same measured rhythm circling his house. Days turned to weeks, and the exhaustion hollowed him out. His resignation letter contained only 3 words: "It will not stop." Others broke down in subtler ways. They became withdrawn, unwilling to speak of what they experienced. They drank heavily, hoping to blur the sound of steps that still echoed in their ears. They avoided their own families, unable to explain the way their nerves twitched at every creak of floorboards or rustle of leaves. They lived in constant anticipation of something unseen, and it drained them slowly, as if their strength was being consumed piece by piece. The psychological impact spread through the town like a sickness. Shops near the cemetery struggled to stay open. Residents spoke of uneasy dreams, even if they never stepped inside the grounds. Some described waking in the night and sensing figures watching from their windows, shadows too still to be reflections. Families packed and left, abandoning homes built by their ancestors, unable to bear the constant press of dread that came from living so close to the graves. The church tried to intervene. Priests urged the townspeople to find strength in faith, to resist the temptation of fear. They led prayers, burned incense, sprinkled holy water at the gates. Yet their voices faltered when they themselves felt the pull of the cemetery. One priest confessed that he no longer prayed near the grounds because he could not bear the silence that swallowed his words. Another admitted privately that he saw faces among the stones during evening mass. Faces pale and unfamiliar, standing motionless until the candles burned low. The church grew quiet about the matter after that. What settled most deeply was paranoia. People did not trust the cemetery, but worse, they did not trust themselves. They doubted their eyes, their ears, even their memories. Was the flower truly gone, or had they forgotten where they placed it? Was the name really faded from the stone, or had they misremembered the letters? Was the shadow they saw drifting across the graves truly there, or had grief warped their vision? This constant uncertainty ate away at their stability. Life became a careful balance between denial and dread, never leaning too far in either direction, for fear of falling into despair. Some chose to fight it directly. They tried to convince themselves the cemetery was only soil and stone. They entered at night, clutching lanterns, determined to prove nothing waited among the graves. They returned pale, shaken, unwilling to speak of what they found. One man who prided himself on strength and logic came back trembling, his face hollow. He locked himself inside his house for weeks, refusing visitors until eventually he left town altogether. His family never saw him again. Generations grew accustomed to avoiding the cemetery. They did not plan weddings near its grounds, did not hold festivals within sight of its walls, did not linger on the roads that bordered it. The cemetery became more than a place of the dead. It became a shadow cast over the living. The town learned to live in its presence, but it was a survival, not a peace. The psychological damage endured because the cemetery did not allow healing. In other towns, the act of mourning eventually softened into memory. Here, mourning became fear. Every visit threatened to reopen wounds. Every burial added weight to the dread already piled high. People grieved not only the loss of their loved ones, but also the certainty that they had placed them into a ground that did not rest. And so, paranoia became inheritance. Children born long after the first stories still carried them. Families who had never set foot inside the cemetery still whispered about it. The fear was no longer tied only to footsteps or shadows. It had become part of the town itself, stitched into its bloodline. What this means is that the cemetery did not simply haunt a place. It haunted minds. It hollowed them slowly, left them trembling, fractured, uncertain. And when fear lodges itself so deeply into the heart of a community, it does not need to show itself anymore. It lives in memory, in suspicion, in silence. The cemetery knew this. The town felt it. And with each passing year, the question remained the same. Was the haunting born of the ground, or was it now born of the people who carried its memory? When the weight of fear grows too heavy, people begin to demand explanations. The cemetery had drawn enough stories, enough unease, that the town could no longer carry it in silence. There were attempts, official, measured, logical, to investigate. There were also whispered theories passed hand to hand, darker in tone, less willing to dismiss what people felt. None of them brought peace. Authorities treated the cemetery as a place prone to trespassers. Reports of footsteps, shadows, and vanished flowers were reduced to human interference. Patrols were increased, gates reinforced, locks replaced. On paper, it was simple. Vandals had taken to the grounds, and fear magnified their presence. Yet the patrols led nowhere. Guards reported hearing the same footsteps as the locals. They chased figures that disappeared in open space. Their flashlights fell on rows of stones where they swore someone had stood moments before. They wrote it up as evasion, but their voices trembled when they spoke of it later. Officials pointed to natural causes. Stones shifted, they claimed, because the soil beneath them had loosened with age. Flowers vanished because animals carried them off. Wax melted on graves because mourners lit candles and failed to confess. Each explanation leaned on what could be seen, what could be touched. Yet even those who clung to these rational accounts carried unease when they walked the grounds. The air was too still, the silence too deliberate. They did not stay long. The paranormal theories spread quietly, almost shamefully, but they spread. Some said the cemetery was restless because of soldiers buried there without proper rites, men who died far from home and never received the prayers meant to carry them across. Others whispered of rituals performed in secret, long before the cemetery was founded, when the land was used for gatherings that left stains on the soil. They believed those stains never faded, and each burial pressed the weight deeper until it broke the surface again. There were also stories of unfinished grief. The idea that sorrow itself could linger, a man buried without forgiveness, a mother buried without her child, a family separated by death and circumstance. That grief clung to the ground, took shape in shadows, walked in footsteps. It was not a spirit in the way people understood it. It was emotion turned physical, memory given weight, a haunting not of souls but of loss. Conspiratorial whispers grew louder over the years. Some claimed the town itself knew the truth and chose to keep it hidden. Why else did records vanish? Why else were priests reluctant to speak openly? They said old documents had been removed from archives, journals burned, church notes erased. The silence, they argued, was not accidental. It was protection. The town feared what would happen if the truth was spoken too clearly. Better to leave it as rumor, better to let fear carry it than to reveal something far worse. Investigators from outside the town came once or twice, drawn by curiosity. They left quickly, their reports thin and evasive. One group carried equipment, cameras, recorders, instruments to measure changes in air and light. They spent a night inside the cemetery. By dawn, they were gone. Their notes mentioned unusual temperature drops, unexplained shadows, and an overwhelming sensation of being observed. The report ended abruptly, without conclusions, as if the words themselves refused to be written. None of the investigators returned. The townspeople absorbed these theories, but none brought relief. Each explanation carried flaws. Vandals could not explain footsteps that stopped without trace. Soil could not explain flowers gone without remains. Rituals left no evidence, only suspicion. Even the notion of grief taking form did not ease the weight. It made it heavier. Because grief never ends, and if it could take shape once, it could take shape again and again. The most unsettling theory was the simplest, that the cemetery itself was alive. Not haunted, not cursed, not possessed. Alive. The earth beneath the stones had absorbed too much. Bodies, sorrow, prayers, silence, and somewhere in that accumulation, it had begun to breathe. The footsteps, the shadows, the shifting soil, all were not the work of spirits but of the ground itself remembering, a memory so heavy that it walked, listened, reached upward. It is impossible to say which theory holds truth, if any do. What endures is not certainty but silence. The cemetery refuses to give answers. It remains as it always has, quiet, waiting, pressing against those who dare enter. Perhaps that is the most haunting part of all. Investigations close, theories fade, evidence disappears, but the cemetery does not change. It does not need to prove itself. It only needs to endure, to wait, to remind the living that some questions are not meant to be answered. And so, the people continue to ask in whispers, is it soldiers? Is it grief? Is it ritual? Is it memory? Or is it something else? Something beyond the language of the living? The silence of the cemetery offers no reply. There are places that the living try to forget, yet they remain. The cemetery stands still at the edge of the town, its stones leaning, its soil uneven, its silence thick with weight. The gates rust, the trees bend under their own age, but the stories continue. They do not fade with time. They do not lose their edge. Every generation inherits them, as though fear itself is passed down alongside blood and memory. People no longer ask what happened there. They ask instead why it has not stopped. Decades have come and gone, lives have ended. Families have scattered, but the footsteps remain. Shadows still drift where no bodies stand. Flowers vanish, stones shift, air thickens. Silence continues to hold its breath. The mystery has become less about what is seen, and more about what it does to those who carry it. A town lives under the weight of the dead, but the dead do not rest. The cemetery is avoided now. Roads near it are empty at night. Children walk the long way home rather than pass its gates. Those who must visit during daylight speak quickly, leave their tokens and retreat. The grounds no longer serve as a place of mourning. They have become a place of warning. A space where people are reminded that not all endings close, not all graves seal, not all silence is peace. What lingers most is not a single story, but the way they echo each other. A widow sees a figure kneeling where flowers vanish. Children hear their names whispered in voices they cannot recognize. Guards chase shadows that vanish between stones. Priests lose their prayers in silence that feels alive. These accounts span decades, spoken by mouths that never met, and yet they match, each one layering over the last until the pattern feels undeniable. Explanations dissolve in the face of this repetition. Vandals do not endure across generations. Animals do not walk in human footsteps. Grief does not repeat itself with such precision, and yet nothing else explains it. The theories remain fractured, like shards of glass that cut when held too long. Official records end in silence. Outside investigators leave in haste, and those who live near the cemetery carry the memory like a sickness that never heals. Perhaps the truth is simple. Perhaps the ground itself remembers. Soil that has taken too much into its depth, names forgotten, grief unspoken, prayers unanswered. The earth does not release what it has swallowed. It holds it, turns it, and gives it back in fragments. Footsteps, shadows, silence. A warning that nothing truly stays buried. The greatest cruelty of the cemetery is the way it turns mourning into dread. People cannot grieve properly there. They cannot lay flowers without wondering who will take them. They cannot pray without feeling their words sink into listening silence. They cannot leave without sensing something followed them. The act of remembering the dead becomes a confrontation with something alive in the soil, something that resists being ignored. Generations have left the town because of it. Houses near the ground stand empty, businesses close, families scatter, yet even those who leave carry it with them. They speak of uneasy dreams, of waking to footsteps on wooden floors, of shadows at the corners of their rooms. The cemetery does not let go. It follows in memory, in suspicion, in fear. Perhaps that is its true reach, not the stones, not the soil, but the way it plants itself inside the minds of those who dared to stand too close. The town no longer tries to resolve it. They have accepted its presence, as one accepts an illness that has no cure. The cemetery is there. It will always be there. It does not need to explain itself because it does not end. It only waits. And so the question remains, sharp and unanswerable, pressing against every silence the town endures. If the dead demand to be remembered, what happens when we refuse? The gates stand locked. The stones lean. The footsteps continue. The cemetery waits.